Hello, everyone. My name is Nick Ostheimer, and today I will be talking about advanced argumentation, structure, and refutation integration in congressional debate. This is going to be a really broad lecture. We're going to be covering basically 3 different types of topics throughout the course of this lecture, so we will be jumping around from a lot of different topics to different topics. But the main idea of this lecture is to tell you guys how to write your speeches, how to write your arguments in a way that is both well-warranted, convincing, and adaptable to the round. First, short introduction of me. I'm Nick Ostheimer. I'm ranked #1 in the country by the NSDA in Congress right now. I have 16 career bids to TOC. I am a NSDA and TOC finalist, and I have had a all-right record on the national circuit, including winning twice the Blue Key tournament at UF, the UK season opener, and in the past 2 months, winning second place at Harvard and the Florida State Championship. I have been the president of my team at FAU for more than 3 years and currently work as a public coach for equality in forensics, teaching the Ruby Advanced Lab, as well as a private coach on my own time. So this lecture is going to go ahead and get started with arguments. What is an argument? An argument is just a claim and a warrant. You have probably heard a lot of different things about what an argument or what a contention is. They are valid, but an argument boils down to 2 very simple components. The claim, what is the argument, and the warrant, why is the argument true? Now, we're going to move on how to make this strategic, but really we shouldn't rush past this very simple part, because the tricky part of warranting and argumentation is having a good warrant in the first place. People love to skip past that, get to the refutation, get to the round structure, get to the cross-ex, but really, if you don't know how to warrant your arguments well, you're going to be lost for all the other topics in Congress. Fortunately, I have a very systematic way to have good arguments, causal and empirical argumentation. The point of this is to warrant each of your arguments in 2 different ways. First, to have a causal, intuitive, analytical link. The point of this link is to present the argument in simple terms that make sense at face value. It is a sentence that includes a what and the why, which sounds a lot like just the core of your warrant, right? Which is exactly what it is. But the main difference here is that you prove causality. You need to explain to us, why does one thing lead to another? Not just what is the status quo, why is the status quo? Not just what is the solution, why does the solution work? That's going to look a lot like this. You make it make sense, you focus on clarity. This is going to be kind of the frontal end of your argument, where you explain that X leads to Y because of this causal argument. The second part is the empirical argumentation, and this is where your evidence comes in. In a speech, your evidence has 2 purposes. First of all, to back up the causal claim with credibility. Often it can be very helpful to have an expert backing up your causal claim so that it doesn't just make sense at face value, but it has a professional, respectable ethos behind it. But not only that, perhaps the most important purpose of evidence is to quantify the truth and the importance of your argument. It's very easy to say that an increase in GDP leads to a drop in unemployment. It's another thing to say that the Center for American Progress writes on March 23rd of 2022 that a drop in GDP leads to a drop in unemployment. That already sounds more valid because you are making a claim about a relationship between 2 factors in the real world. Now you're backing it up by a citation from a respected organization. But even better is if you can use that evidence to quantify the relationship between those 2 phenomena. The Center for American Progress writes on March 23rd of 2023 that a 20% drop in GDP leads to a 20% drop in unemployment. That's going to look something more like this. The evidence to back up the causal link, specifically with quantification. This structure is especially useful to use because it makes sure that you don't miss any bases when making your argument. More often than you might think, people prep out their speeches and they only have one of these. But really that means that your speech is just standing on one leg. you have the causal, intuitive, analytical link without any evidence to back it up, or you're just giving us this correlative evidence without any causal argumentation to tell us why it makes sense. Now, here's an example of what that might look like for an actual speech. Here's an argument against strategic independence. The tagline might something like, "Don't risk Chinese retaliation to passing this policy." Moving on to your causal link, passing this legislation would provoke China to retaliate because they want the US to continue buying their rare earth minerals. In 2019, when President Trump threatened to impose tariffs on Chinese rare earth minerals, the Center for Strategic and International Studies writes that China retaliated by imposing a 25% tariff on US rare earth mineral production. So you can see how this whole argument is split up into two parts to make sure it's not missing anything. You have the part of the argument making it make sense. What is China doing? Why are they doing it? And then you have the evidence to back it up with actual quantification and a source to show that there is ethos behind that statement. Now, this is all just part of your warranting. That's how you make a good argument. The next part is making it a good speech, applying these principles to structure. And this section is likely going to be a review for a lot of you because we're talking about block structure, status quo, solution, impact, going through these three stages in your speech to explain why you should pass or fail the bill. Now, a lot of you may have heard this block structure used specifically as a format for sponsorship or authorship speeches, but that is not the extent of its use. I think you can use block structure to prep out pretty much any style of speech in Congress. Early round, mid round, late round, AF or neg, all of these components are useful for telling us what's going on right now, how does the bill change it, why is that good or bad. So first, let's talk about the importance of the problem and solution blocks. In this part, you do pretty much two in each. You tell us what is the problem in need of fixing, why does that problem exist? As far as the status quo goes, you tell us the causal link between those two things. Now, for the solution, you tell us what does the bill do, along with an explanation of the sections, and explain how and why does that solve the problem. You give us the causal link between those two things as well. The reason that your solution works always has to link back to why the problem exists. Otherwise, you don't prove solvency well. A lot of people struggle with applying this to neg speaking, but solvency is the exact same. You just say that there is some sort of problem or perhaps something good in the status quo, and then you explain how the mechanism of the bill makes an existing problem worse or changes something good in the status quo to become bad or get rid of it. So a closer look at the problem block. We can look at a problem like carbon emissions. We are dealing with an excess of carbon emissions because companies have no reason not to emit carbon dioxide. The United States people are struggling with a cost of living crisis because people don't get paid enough. The world is facing Russian and Chinese military aggression because America hasn't stepped up to deter that aggression coming from Russia and China. That always leads us to our solution block, where we talk about the legislation and why what it does works to solve that problem. If we're talking about the cost of living crisis, that's a problem we might apply to a bill that raises the minimum wage. So we tell us that when you pass this bill, Americans earn more money because Section 1A increases the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Or if the problem is something like Chinese military aggression in the South China Sea, we might say, we deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan because the resolved clause of this resolution creates a military base on Taiwan. One asterisk for your solvency block. I think a very important thing to have in your speeches is really focusing on the ethos behind the source giving an opinion on the solvency. It's really important to remember we are 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds talking about congressional federal policy. If I were a judge, I would not take us at face value. even if you have a good argument regarding the problem and the solution, judges have a hard time believing you and vesting faith in you unless you have experts making up your advocacy. So when you talk about the specific reason you should pass or fail this bill, you want to focus the citation on the author's credentials, not just have a cursory citation of an organization. For example, Ilya Simon, a law professor at George Mason University, writes in September of 2022 that letting states conduct their own refugee admissions would enable far more people to escape poverty and tyranny. That's an expert solvency advocate. Moving on, let's talk about impacts. Speeches should have one impact, maybe two. This is probably not what you do in Congress right now, but I think the reason is pretty simple. You have very, very little time in a Congress speech. And a lot of the time, people go for 2, 3 arguments, often trying to impact out to a bunch of different things. But using that little time to try and cover that much ground means you're sacrificing the depth of your argumentation for breadth. Instead of decisively proving one thing, you're wishy-washy in 4. That doesn't win rounds. Congress rounds often boil down to 1 or 2 or 3 clashes. You can easily be the most important speaker in the round just by decisively turning the tide on one of those clashes. To do that, you need to spend 3 minutes of your speech proving why your side is right on a key piece of analysis. For impacting in particular, there are 3 things you need to do: quantify, terminalize, humanize. You need to give us a specific number for how much is going on, what's happening, what does the bill do? Quantify. You want to terminalize. You want to give us the full extent of what's going on when you pass or fail this bill. And as you can see the balloons flying up around me, that just means I'm right. But that brings us to 3. You want to terminalize that impact to a human consequence. For example, if we're talking about a trade bill, people will almost definitely give you an impact about the growth in GDP that we'll have if we pass this bill. Everyone knows GDP is good. It grows the economy, right? But what does it mean for the economy to grow? How does that affect the American working class? How does that affect the American middle class? What is the impact on unemployment, on homelessness, on education, on social mobility? Each of those things are way more human impacts that will resonate with your judges much more than abstract economical impacts. GDP is absolutely important, but you cannot convince your judges to care more about GDP than homelessness or education or income unless you tell us the link between GDP and those things. That is the purpose of terminalization. So block structure tells you how to make a strategic argument, but not necessarily a true one. You can try and cover status quo, solvency, impact, and butcher the warranting for each of them. So let's combine what we've learned for block structure with causal and empirical argumentation. All in all, the structure of a speech might look something like this. You have a claim in the status quo, backed up by your causal and empirical argumentation, and then the same for your solvency and your impact. So we're going to cover a brief example of a speech that uses all these components put together. And this is going to be a speech on a bill I wrote, Strategic Independence, with really all of the rhetoric cut out, just the pure argumentation formatted in these blocks. In the status quo, the US is dependent on other nations for strategically important goods. Our national defense is vulnerable because we're dependent on other nations for those goods. Halima Najib Locke, the Pentagon's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Industrial Resilience, advises in December of 2022 that our dependence on these items is a strategic weakness that would weaken our ability to sustain conflict. Xianbin Yao, former senior advisor to the president, writes on August 7th of 2022 that America depends on raw materials and processed goods from China to construct most of its military equipment. To date, all of the F-35s that have been built for the US military, roughly 600 planes, contain a Chinese rare earth alloy. So that's your causal block. the intuitive statement of why we're dependent on other countries for these goods, and the empirical evidence telling us why it's a bad thing, how we're dependent on those other countries. Moving on to the solvency block. We can fix that. When Section 1 creates an additional 15% import tariff on these goods to wean the military off foreign imports, and Section 2 dedicates $100 billion to subsidize domestic extraction and processing of these goods, we can achieve strategic independence with tariffs and subsidies because we have untapped reserves of these goods. That's exactly what Ellen Lord, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisitions, recommends in October of 2023. She writes that even though we have massive reserves of rare earths, we've fallen far behind other countries in extraction, processing, and manufacturing, only because the government has been doing nothing to help out the sector. Our domestic supply is begging for government support and stimulation. So here we have the solvency block with the causal and empirical block warranting it, telling us how the bill is going to accomplish it with these two different solvency mechanisms, why it's going to work. And of course, the expert solvency advocate here telling us why and how that's a good idea, leading us to our impact. This bill achieves strategic independence. You make America prepared for both conflict and supply chain disruptions because we will have the domestic supply necessary to achieve strategic independence. Pat Maio reports on February 7th of 2024 in the Wall Street Journal that an American mine just discovered 2.3 billion metric tons of rare earths in Halleck Creek, Wyoming. It includes the metals and minerals we need to make electric vehicles, wind turbines, robots, military drones, and computer chips. This discovery puts the US ahead of China in terms of our domestic supply of rare earth minerals. But the next step is extracting and using those resources. Doing so would make us the #1 global source of neodymium, praseodymium, terbium, and butynetriol, ensuring our strategic independence, but only if we pass. So that's how you might apply block structure and causal argumentation all together to put together a speech. So before we move on and blaze on to the next thing, any questions? Go ahead, Leonie.
So with this structure, is signpost, how do we signpost?
You would want to signpost with your taglines up top. So for example, in your tagline for the status quo, I tell you that the US is dependent on other nations for these goods. This is the overarching claim that I warrant in the causal and empirical block. You have a similar tagline for the solvency and the impact. What's up, Kabir?
So I was just gonna ask, what does the block structure look like in a crystal, or not specifically a crystal, but more a late round speech?
Fantastic question. We're going to talk about that when we look at refutation integration, and I'll give you an example of a crystallization speech I gave in Harvard semis following this structure.
Okay, thank you.
Rohan.
Is there a specific way to pad down this structure like onto pads, or is this like more for digital form and then being delivered off an iPod?
I use it on an iPad. I think this is probably not hard to port over to a pad. The way I would probably do it is have sticky notes, 6 sticky notes on the pad, 2 for each block, and 1 respectively for the causal statement and 1 for the empirical statement. I think that leaves you with a lot of modularity on the pad because you can switch around your blocks and also switch around your evidence as necessary.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sure. All right, fantastic. Moving on, I have this list of 5 example speeches, some of which I'm going to examine now, but I will link these once the lecture is done and in the description of the YouTube video. If you guys want to just look at how I write and pad these speeches, they're public, free, open. Feel free to copy the structure. At this point, feel free to copy the sources. I just figured it would be helpful. All right, that was not supposed to open. All right, moving on from the examples to tying all of that speech together with a good thesis statement. I think this is probably still the #1 issue that beginners in Congress have in their speeches. They have poor clarity. They make arguments, but they never frame them. They make arguments, but they struggle in communicating them to their judges. Something that makes it a lot easier is a thesis statement that does these 3 things after your introduction and before your status quo block. You want to signpost the content of your entire speech. So pretty much you have your status quo, solvency, and impact block, right? Covering the 3 different parts of your speech. You can just tie your thesis into all 3. You want to summarize the core of your argument. So secondly, your thesis should pretty much boil down your entire speech into 1 sentence. And third, once you're getting into the nitty-gritty of hoping everything matches up and makes sense, check. Does the thesis make sense? Does it sound good? Think of this like going through a mathematical formula for gravity or something, and at the end of the question, if the answer just doesn't make any sense from a numerical perspective, then it's wrong. The same way here, if your thesis statement sounds weird, doesn't make sense, you did something wrong along the way, or you need to reformulate your thesis. One example of a really great thesis statement that I liked from my Harvard finals round is this, and I'm going to cover the speech so you guys can see how this thesis statement ties into all 3 components of the speech. You fail, since struggling pharmacies would be shut down by a 7% price cap, making all drugs inaccessible for millions of Americans. Pharmacies have a very tight turnaround. Senator Khan admits to me in cross-ex that pharmacies will be affected no matter what, since they have to be here in the US to sell drugs. They have an average markup rate of 20% because they use most of that money for upkeep. According to the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality in October of 2023, the average pharmacy imposes a 20% markup on drugs. Senator Khan agreed to that in cross-ex too. But they only collect a total profit margin of 3.3%. That's where Senator Marathe got his business terms mixed up. Profit does not equal markup. Profit equals markup minus the cost of operation. That means 96.7% of what they charge consumers goes toward buying drugs, paying staff salaries, conducting marketing, and paying taxes. That's why a 7% cap would be uniquely devastating for pharmacies. They'll shut down because they can't make enough money to stay open. Simple as that. We already see that happening now. Dima Kato, a pharmacology professor at USC, estimates on October 22nd of 2023 that 1 in 4 neighborhoods are already in a pharmacy desert. That's only because they can't turn a profit due to the already competitive nature of the market and pharmacies struggling against one another to make a profit. Flashback to Senator Lung, he proved that there will be fewer drugs. That means higher prices. So while making less money from their sales, pharmacies will have to pay even more to get their supply in the first place. At the end of the day, these shutdowns deny millions of Americans access to drugs. Americans need pharmacies because they're the only quick way to access most over-the-counter drugs and many more specialized or restricted prescriptions. That even happens along socioeconomic lines. Research conducted in 2022 by Cornell and Yale University found that of the 670 pharmacy deserts in New York City, LA, Chicago, and Houston, all but 3 were found in predominantly minority neighborhoods. So at the end of the day, let's do some weighing. Senator Khan, how could you possibly improve access for millions of Americans when their primary source of drugs shuts down? Senator Kareem, manufacturers and suppliers have earned your righteous indignation, but humble pharmacies don't deserve to be caught in the crossfire. All right, so let's go back to the thesis statement. I'll read it one more time. You fail since struggling pharmacies would be shut down by a 7% price cap, making all drugs inaccessible for millions of Americans. Does anyone have any questions, notes, or observations of how this ties the different parts of the speech together? Kabir.
So this is just a question. So like normally when I do a thesis statement or so, I've had this weird thing where are you supposed to say first has to do to accomplish two things, or pass to accomplish two things, and then say the two exact points, or just give a general idea of why you pass or fail?
I think that's fine. If you're going to have a 2-point speech, it makes sense to have pretty much two of these statements instead of just one. I think the important part is just going through this arc of status quo, solution, impact, because it makes sense from a narrative structure. One thing flows to the next, and recapping all of that in a thesis is a very good way to make sure it flows well in the judge's brain too, instead of just flopping down an argument then warranting it in the speech itself, because this gives you a peek at all the warrants too.
Okay, thank you.
Angela.
Well, I'd like to say that's due to the very convenient highlighting. You can see how each individual phrase correlates with solvency, a status quo, and impact. So like struggling pharmacies is your status quo. Solvency is shut down by 7% price cap. And then the third is the drugs inaccessible for millions of Americans.
Yeah, exactly. And for all my fellow iPad speakers out there, if you're going to be delivering your speech off of a pad, having this type of color coding may improve your fluency, your delivery, and your pad dependency a lot, because it means that things match up. Your brain will link red with status quo, blue with solvency, green with impact. It just makes it more readable and more comfortable. All right, fantastic. Let's move on and talk about integrating refutation. One of the biggest struggles that people have with block structure is wondering, how do they integrate refutation and name drops into this seemingly rigid structure for a speech? Because you have these three components, you can prep them out, have a perfect constructive, that's it. But it feels kind of clunky to go back and adjust the speech afterwards as the round goes on, and you need to integrate refutation. Don't drop the block structure. Maybe drop the argument, but stick to the structure, because that narrative is still a very, very good way to address and integrate challenges to your side and to your speech. Because we should ask ourselves one clarification question, and I want to hear your guys' answer, and I want you guys to disagree on this. Should refutation include your constructive arguments, or should that refutation focus solely on clash? Should you only say, Senator Kabir is wrong, or should I tell you Senator Ostheimer is wrong, then give you the warrant for that ref? Kabir.
I think name dropping is ineffective if you can't actually prove that they're wrong. So you should probably have the constructive argument.
Okay. All right, does anyone disagree? I mean, yeah, of course you have to prove why someone is wrong. But what I'm saying is that's not necessarily the same thing as tying it own to the content of your own speech. So, for example, in a half ref, it's very common for someone to spend half of the speech making one contention, and then the other half reffing other speakers. So how do you guys feel about that? David?
Are these things mutually exclusive? Because I feel like you could do both.
Well, you can do both in the same speech.
All right.
Arian?
I mean, you can only you can have a refutation block that only clashes with the other side, but I feel like a lot of times it's more effective to have in your own argument that's fundamentally opposing it. Like if your argument is true, then the other argument of senators on the opposing side isn't true.
Interesting. Zaid?
Yeah, so I think it like really just depends on where your placement is. Like if you're a last speech, it should be mostly focused on summarizing the round, saying exactly what happened. If you're like in the mid round or like kind of like an early round and you still have to get some refutation out of the way, I think you should definitely have a constructive in your refutation.
All right, got it. So Zaid thinks that the later you get into the round, the less original constructive material you have. Cooper?
Yeah, I kind of think that most refutation should at least be from the perspective of your constructive arguments, i.e., like you don't want multiple speakers might like affirm a bill for different reasons, and you want to make sure that your like general speech has like stays consistent within the narrative and doesn't go off into like other points. Whereas like you can still like independently refute things, but you should definitely like tie it back generally.
Gotcha. All right. So a couple of different perspectives. Let's move on to the answer. The answer is you should include your own constructive argument and tie it into the speech. Why? Because you have 3 minutes of speaking time. Everything you do with that time should amount to a shared goal. You don't want to split up your speech into two separate contentions that have nothing to do with each other for the same reason that you don't want to go off and refute everyone individually, line by line. That's inefficient. You aren't leveraging the very little time you have in a productive way. You aren't using a warrant to impact out to one really large consequential round-winning impact or trying to engage with multiple different parts of the debate. That's why you want to weave refutation into this structure. Status quo, solvency, impact, instead of treating refutation as a separate part of your speech. Zaid raised an interesting point that's a little bit different from this. He says that late round speakers, like a Crystallization, shouldn't have constructive material because their burden is to summarize and wrap up the round. This is a valid perspective, and I think 5 years ago, any authority in Congress would have told you the exact same thing. I just don't think it's the meta anymore. I don't think it's strategic because judges are reluctant to give the one to a speaker that adds nothing new to the round. If you only go up as a Crystallization speaker to give us mitigation, defense, and weighing, you're not really tipping the scales decisively in the favor of your own side because you're not introducing a new perspective. You're not moving the debate along. You're just reframing it. And using your speech only to reframe what other people have said isn't optically great because it can be a great speech, but it's not original, it's not novel, and you don't stand out from an argumentative standpoint. That's why I think that even late round speakers usually have a constructive argument dominating their speaking style, or even if they're consolidating a clash in the debate, they are coming up with a novel answer to it, bringing up new arguments, bringing up new sources to decide it in favor of one side or the other. So long story short, to make your argument clash and integrate that with block structure, you want to choose and structure your arguments around the clash of the debate. So for example, if you're the sixth affirmative and you disagree with the other side about solvency, you want to choose an argument that clashes with the other side on solvency. If you come into the debate with a sponsorship prepped out and you have your status quo solvency impact block done, you don't get to give it. You get dropped. You have to speak as the sixth AF. You should not, absolutely not be using the same speech structure you came prepared with. You shouldn't even be using most of what you had written beforehand. I think if less than 50% of your speech has been written in round at that point, you simply haven't adapted enough to what's going on in the debate. Your structure is flexible. Everything is subject to change. So the entire philosophy for giving a Crystallization speech in this framework of block structure is centering the debate around part of the block structure. I can give you a couple of examples of that and read it out. I'll actually open this pre-K example speech. and deliverant. And I want you guys to answer after this. Where do you think, as a crystallization speaker, I ended up engaging with the most in this debate? What was the biggest point of contention? Children should never feel like a ball and chain. Too often, they are. I drag my parents along to tournaments across the country, beg them to drive me to hang out with my friends, and I'm certain that a few more weeks of whining will win me a Nintendo Switch. They know all too well. The cost adds up. At the end of the day, you pass, because adequate funding has been proven to fix universal pre-K, which improves social mobility for students and parents. But first, let's address this central question from the negation. Is there a difference between funding and fixing pre-K? The answer is no, because a lack of funding is the best way to ensure that bad pre-K programs become good pre-K programs. Speakers like Senator DuPaul and Marathe will refuse to fund pre-K, then remark that public pre-K is bad. Reminds me of those kids on the playground that would run up to you, grab your hand, and slap you with it. Stop hitting yourself, stop hitting yourself. But Jackie Mader writes about the infamous Tennessee program for the Heshinger Report on February 2nd of 2022. She writes that failures like the Tennessee pre-K failure were due to funding and quality. In fact, Tennessee directly addressed Senator DuPaul's concerns about incentives by awarding funding based on quality and partnering with external evaluators. Senators, the Department of Education isn't dumb. They aren't going to repeat known mistakes, especially if Senators DuPaul, Melendez, and Beck keep checking up on them. That means we reward quality, not mediocrity. Now, this debate has only been worth having because Senator Kim amended this bill to provide funding, but Senator Marathe still says that $100 billion isn't enough. He wants to keep dreaming of bigger yachts and LA mansions, but I'm dreaming of a future where America can actually provide for its people. That's why I'm so glad to decisively conclude this clash and propose an amendment after the speech to borrow $500 billion to implement this bill. Senator Beck thinks this debate is over, but don't let him take this choice away from you. Leave a crushing burden on the shoulders of hardworking parents, or a judicious loan that the people of this nation can pay back together. Here's why you pass my amendment and my bill. We've proven that we improve social mobility for both parents and students. First, parents. The Urban Institute writes in May of 2021 that every child places a massive financial burden on the parents. Families spend an average of $76,000 to raise children to the age of 17. But when you pass, Senator Beck, you alleviate at least 1/3 of that burden, allowing the low-income families you advocate for to build intergenerational wealth. But second, students. Senator Burstein tells you just how beneficial pre-K is for students when it comes to college enrollment, which the US News and World Report told us just last January is still one of the biggest determinants of social mobility. So when you pass, you decisively improve educational outcomes like college enrollment to ensure that low-income students can break the cycle. When I go back home at the end of this week, I can't look my parents in the eye and tell them, I failed a bill that could have saved them tens of thousands of dollars on me. Don't make me do that, senators. All right. So let's go back here. Where does the speech focus refutation? Tanmay.
Mostly on solvency.
Yes. How could you tell?
That's where majority of your clash was, and you had to do the most warranting, because everywhere else it was like kind of here's the facts, but specifically on solvency you had to fight for it, I guess, because it was more contentious from the amount of refutation you had and the fact that you had more and several warrants.
True. This was a 6th affirmative speech on the Harvard pre-K bill in semis. This debate centered on whether we have enough funding to improve pre-K and on whether funding actually improves pre-K in the first place. So I address both those clashes in the solvency block because that's where most of the disagreement came from the negation. I wrote probably 90% of this in round because I observed that the negation all had this common denominator in their speeches. The speeches manifested in different ways. Like Senator DuPaul told us about the Tennessee program, giving us this big empiric about why the pre-K failure wasn't due to funding, but to structural reform. And Senator Melendez told us that not giving it enough funding would be a bad idea because the teacher shortage was going to exacerbate the harm of an underfunded and under-equipped universal pre-K system. So I addressed all those challenges by saying, okay, let's have more money. And second, that money is going to work. Rohan.
So I was wondering, did you know that you were gonna like be giving the 6 staff on this, or were you just trying to like stand up for every ask you said you couldn't, or just like unfortunate that you had to give the 6 staff?
I was pretty happy to give the 6th AF. Funny little story. This was actually a pretty AF-heavy bill after Senator Kim proposed the amendment because it made it a little bit AF-heavy, or at least very debatable. And I had poor recency. A lot of people were trying to speak.
Yeah.
I could actually tell that Jimmy Beck was standing up for both AF and neg on every cycle because he really, really wanted to speak. So looking around the room, I could tell that if he stood up for the neg, for the 5th neg, after giving the 5th AF, I would actually get the 6th AF. So I ended up making it just in time. So yeah, pay very close attention, I guess.
Okay, because I was just like asking that to see because I feel like whenever I'm trying to prep in round, if I have to like stand up for every speech while I'm trying to adjust my speech, it's like not well adjusted. But if I know I'm just gonna have to speak at the end, I feel like I can like be more relaxed and just like it's easier for me to prep for the crystal or whatever speech I'm giving.
Great points. I definitely did plan the speech to speak late. I had nothing written down on my pad until like the end of the 2nd neg. And by that point, I realized, okay, this is where the neg's best ground is. I'm going to start thinking about how I'm going to do it and then adapt whatever I hear into my solvency block. So this pretty much kept growing until it was time to give my speech. I was not standing up every time, deleting, adding, removing, feeling like a mess because I was raising my hand for every cycle. In tournaments with preset recency, use your preset recency as a benchmark, a guide for when in the round you're going to go. If you're very late and everyone's trying to speak, you're going to speak late. So plan for that.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Fatima.
When you were prepping in round, did you use the block structure or did you use a block structure after you gave the speech?
I used it in round.
So you did all the highlighting and everything in round and just gave it on your iPad?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Kabir.
Okay, so say I have to give like an overview. You know how say there's a bill about the federal the national debt, and I have to make a definition about what the national debt is. Will that just go before the block structure, or do I define that in my status quo?
That probably belongs in your status quo. If you're a late round speaker who is trying to refute the other side by saying that they misunderstand what the national debt is, then that's going to belong in your status quo block. If you're going to talk about how they misunderstand what the bill does about the national debt, that belongs in your solvency block. And if they misunderstand how the bill is going to affect the national debt for better or for worse, that belongs in your impact block. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Great. Siraz.
Hey, so what would you do if you were like planning to give a late round speech and it just happened to be that it was like really act heavy or something? Because so in States 2 weeks ago, I was planning to give a late round neg speech, but there was like no neg speaker, so I gave like the 2nd neg, and I think that's like what dropped me because I wasn't prepared for it. So yeah, what would you do?
Never be the sacrificial lamb. Don't stand up to give speeches that you aren't prepared to give. If your side doesn't have enough speeches, let the AF break cycle and shoot themselves in the foot by going 2nd, 3rd AF in a row. Speak when you're ready. Take your time. There is no point in giving a speech just to give a mediocre speech.
Okay, yeah. So do you think like so like the judges wouldn't really like care as much? I sort of just went up because I was like, oh, I don't want them to be like, I don't know.
Well, they don't have to know that you have neg prep, which you're ready to give. Just don't, stick your head out and say, oh, I have a neg speech, but give me like 5 more minutes. Give me 5 more minutes. Prep silently. Don't do anything that'll make you optically look bad if you don't stand up to speak. Take your time. Speak when you're ready.
Got it. Thanks.
Tanmay.
So I can see how it's easy to like integrate on an iPad. Do you have a suggestion how to integrate that type of ref inside the block on a pad? Because I've struggled with integrating it, like trying to pad it all, like adapting mid-round.
Yeah, I really like sticky notes. I think, like I told Rohan, probably the way that I would do this on a legal pad is with sticky notes and write down my causal statement for a solvency block on one sticky note, my empirical block for a solvency block on another sticky note, and then integrate all my refutation in the margins. Like if I'm going to use my evidence to ref someone, I might write an arrow on the pad itself and say, okay, ref Senator Rai and Fatima. And I also might write like some conclusions in the bottom to implicate it back out to the debate and write that on the pad. That's probably how I would do it. Fatima.
Since you created most of your speech in round, how did you memorize all the refutations and like all the evidence you had? I understand memorizing your points, but how were you able to memorize all the different paragraphs you had using the block structure?
I memorized nothing. I understand the content well enough to feel comfortable giving it without having to look at my pad the whole time. I'm not the most pad independent speaker out there. I do write everything out, but I like writing everything out because I feel like my tactile memory is pretty good. So if I write it out, I feel like it's kind of imprinted in me and I can like I can say what I wrote without having to look at my pad for it. That may easily not be the case for most of you. I would recommend good technique for Congress is write yourself notes in shorthand instead of writing everything out like this. Of course, one perk of writing everything out like this is that I can present it in slideshows and you guys can see everything I did and said.
Okay.
All right, we'll skip this example and go towards one last one. So let's think about this mid-round speech. Less like a crystallization, more like mid-round ref. Think here, where does the refutation focus? Where does everything kind of centralize? And this is for a speech on Haiti. Oh, Kabir, you have a question?
No, like, isn't mid-round more focused on solvency since early round has established the status quo?
Not necessarily. You may easily disagree on what the status quo is by the very end of the round, and then crystallization speakers are going to, hash out that debate. In the mid-round, you don't necessarily focus on solvency, just like you don't necessarily focus on anything, but you might. Really, you just focus on clash wherever it is. If everyone's disagreeing about the status quo, you focus on that. On the solvency, you focus on that. On the impact, you focus on that. So here I want you to think about, where does the ref focus? To close out this debate for the affirmation, let's actually hear from Haitians why helping their police force to fight back gangs will create the conditions for prosperity. Senator Ayer, Haitian police are struggling to control gang violence because they don't have enough funding and equipment, not because they're corrupt. Gary Desroyers, a business owner in Port-au-Prince, Haiti's capital, spoke to the Associated Press yesterday on March 1st regarding a series of coordinated violent attacks by gang members across the capital. He says that hundreds of young officers fought to guarantee the security of the population, even though these gangs are estimated to control 80% of the capital. Even though they had the will, police faced a lack of logistics and equipment to properly fight the gangs. That's exactly why they need our support. Across the aisle, from Senator Fermin to Tao, from Senator Tomasini to St. Flour, we've agreed that crime is the root cause of Haiti's desolate poverty. So vote for whichever side proves they best stop crime. That leads you to a ballot for the affirmation. Because Lionel Lazare, a general coordinator for Police Oversight Union in Haiti, talked to Reuters on January 22nd of 2024. He said that Haiti's national police had lost nearly 3,300 officers in 3 years. Senator St. Fleur, these police aren't working with gangs. Lazare tells you Haiti's police force is failing because they are missing incentives to justify the danger associated with the job. That's why you pass, because Section 3B allocates $200 million uniquely for the Haitian National Police, giving them the wages and equipment necessary to stop organized crime. Senators St. Fleur and Clayton are both concerned about accountability and corruption. Fair enough, but Senator Mishra told you that Section 3C creates a monitoring framework that allows us to adjust funding based on where it's used best. That leads you to a ballot for the affirmation, because we pave the way for economic growth in Haiti. You lift Haitians out of poverty because, Senator Corblianu, getting rid of crime allows this bill's investment in the Caribbean single market economy to create prosperity. A joint paper by Harvard Business School and the International Monetary Fund on February 3rd of 2023 finds that prosperity in international trade leads to democratization and deters criminal violence. As citizens and politicians alike can pay their bills fair and square, they have no need for gangs. They have no need for corruption. That trend has held true every time. But Senators Tao and Corblianu express doubt about creating that economic growth. Well, the only way to achieve that solvency is passing this bill to invest $800 million into Haitian businesses and international trade. Where's the focus?
It's spread out pretty evenly.
Okay, does anyone disagree? All right, we're going with Kabir's statement that it's spread out evenly. Yes, that's right. There is no focus for the refutation. And that's normal. You want to engage with a clash where it's happening. At this point in the debate, everyone had disagreed on pretty much every aspect of the debate. The status quo, the solvency, the impact. All those disagreements had been pretty simple. There hadn't been much contribution to them. So my role as a speaker was just to further debate along on each of them and to make an argument. Tanmay.
In the middle of the round, say, for example, in the mid round, if you realize there's not a debate on the status quo and it's been established, would you remove it and replace it with something else? And if so, what do you replace it with? Like, because at Harvard, actually on the same bill, we all agreed on the status quo. And I gave a block structure, but I felt like it was not the most strategic thing to spend like a good chunk on the status quo when everyone agreed on it.
Fair. You can cut it out. That's what I did for the pre-K speech. I think if you disagree, if you all agree on the status quo, and often you do, especially as the debate goes on, you can just cut it out and spend more time on the solvency and impact. That's it.
So do you go directly to those things? Like, how would that transition go from the thesis to straight to solvency?
Like this for the pre-K speech. They know all too well the cost adds up.
Oh, okay, so you can go straight
at the end of the day. Yeah, just going, straight from the intro to the thesis. Thesis is only talking about the solvency and the impact, then to your thesis, then to your solvency. Kabir?
So there's no impacting on any part but the impact, right? You're just summarizing status quo and solvency.
No.
Okay.
I'm definitely reffing in status quo and solvency.
No, I didn't mean like refutation. What I meant was like impacting, like the impact of the status quo, impact of solvency. That doesn't happen normally, right?
Well, they don't really have an impact insofar as they lead to the impact part of your speech. Each part of your speech isn't like a unique self-contained contention. all the blocks are working together to form one argument for your speech. And why that argument is important is your impact block.
Sorry, I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. So one really big question is, and you should all be asking yourselves this, how do you decide where to clash? Where should the refutation be focused? How do I tell? You know, you can go into a round, everyone's talking about something different. You will disagree. Now, that's a great question, and I'm not gonna talk about it too much right now because it's a wholly different topic that deserves like an hour-long lecture all by itself. I discuss it in the slides I have linked there, as well as the lecture video that is on the EIF channel from a few months ago. So the answer to that question lies in yet another long lecture. Great. So that is the end of our lecture on advanced argumentation and structure. I hope you guys appreciate that. All of the links, the documents, and the slideshow referenced in this lecture will be available in the description at the bottom.